Hey, welcome back to my introduction and summary of Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman. This week we'll be covering chapters 2 through 5. As I stated in my last video, this is unscripted, so it is pretty unpolished. I guess in a way this serves as a review of the book and a personal project. Yeah, so it's going to be imperfect. But what what else are you going to do? Click off and watch a different video? Please don't. Anyways, let's begin. So chapter 3 is titled The Control of Money. And so this chapter begins by stating what was the popular contention of economic affairs at the time that Friedman wrote this book, 1962. The popular view of economists was that government intervention in the economy was necessary in order to secure growth and combat the instability in what they perceived to be inherent to competitive capitalism. But Friedman argues that it's actually government intervention that often leads to the instability and lack of growth. He introduces something he'll go into later, that the Great Depression was actually exacerbated by the government in the Federal Reserve System, which was responsible for monetary policy in the 30s. But also, the government also restricts and constrains growth through things like high taxes, tariffs, overburdensome regulations, and price and wage fixing. All of these things serve to sort of muddle and confuse economic affairs. Yeah, they're often created without any thorough thought to the potential consequences and downstream effects that creating these policies might have. But, he says, that doesn't mean that the government has no role in the economy. Quite the contrary. Remember, government should be the rule maker and the umpire. It should create the framework, as he says, that will ensure that the economy runs smoothly. But it should not be an active hand in shaping the direction of monetary policy. So his project, he says in this chapter, is to chart the best course of economic domestic policy in between two extremes. The first one is in completely automatic gold standard, and the other is economic control through a central power, a federal government. He's saying that neither the gold standard or the centralized economic control is preferred. So, what's wrong with the gold standard? Well, on paper, a pure gold standard, a world where people use gold as money, would be ideal. There would be no need for a government to manage, like the Federal Reserve System does, the amount of money in the economy, because the amount of money in the economy would be dependent upon, well, the physical amount of gold there is, and the cost it takes to produce that gold, and of course the demand for it. But the problem is, in Friedman's view, is that this has never existed in real life, this pure gold standard. Pretty much in every case, societies that have gold standards develop things like paper money, which are theoretically convertible into the physical gold. Okay, right? No one is ever buying or selling things with gold, but they did buy and sell things with dollars, which supposedly represented physical gold pieces. And pretty much in every single complex financial system, things like credit and, banknotes will be developed, which means that we'll have essentially dollars that are not necessarily backed by a gold piece. Add on to that the need for government to manage and counteract counterfeiting of these like physical paper money, then all of a sudden government has a vested interest in managing the value of money. And so, as Friedman explains, this was pretty much the system that we had in the United States until the early 20th century. That is, a government-managed money supply, where the paper money in circulation is in part tied to a reserve of physical gold. But after a period of successive financial crises, the government eventually created the Federal Reserve in 1913. Not long after that, World War I happened. And after that, well, most of the world, which was also on the gold standard like ours, they just abandoned having their money tied to gold at all. I suppose some context here. After the First World War, when a whole bunch of other countries abandoned the gold standards, we in effect did as well for a time. But we reinstituted it in the 40s, and we still had it when Friedman was writing this book in the 60s. But in real life, after Friedman published this book, we abandoned the gold standard, aka the theoretical convertibility of paper dollars into physical gold. We abandoned it in the 70s, and we haven't had it back since. Anyways, so now Friedman is arguing, arguing that this Federal Reserve that was created really in the context of a gold standard was now, for a time, left to manage the money supply and the value of money without a gold standard. And this so happened to coincide with the economic crises of the Great Depression and the Second World War. And now we'll get into his criticisms of the Federal Reserve and his charge that they essentially contributed or made the Great Depression worse. Okay, so the thing about the Great Depression that people often misinterpret, it wasn't just a long rolling crises. It was basically like three contractions just close to each other. Kind of like how the 100 Years' War, if you're familiar, wasn't literally a war fought over 100 years. It was three separate wars, but really close together. Okay, so how does Friedman explain the Federal Reserve's failures in the Great Depression? So the stock market crashes in September of 1929, and this is what is widely considered the start of the Great Depression. But, as Friedman points out, for a whole year after the stock market crash, there was zero evidence to suggest that this crisis would balloon into anything worse than any of the other previous financial crises in our nation's history. However, what really catapulted this, I guess, comparatively minor stock market crash, of course, compared to like the absolute scale of misery that would ensue, would be the bank failures in November of 1930. So the bank failures started because there was a run on the banks, which means that where the depositors were trying to convert deposits into currency, aka pretty much everyone trying to get their money out of the bank at the same time. And when the banks failed to do this, they started closing. You see, if you're unfamiliar with how banks work, they work on a fractional basis, okay? So you put a dollar into your bank account, right? And the bank, well, it needs to pay the salaries of its employees, and it also lends money to businesses or loans, maybe to buy a house or something like that. So you put in your dollar, right? Let's say 80% of your dollar the bank will take, along with 80% of, 4 other dollars from your friends. So now the bank has 80% of 5 people's dollars. Now it has, in effect, $4 that it's going to lend out or pay its employees, right? Or maintain infrastructure and whatnot, okay? And so if you want to take your dollar back out, now they're just going to move their money around, okay? They're going to take the 20 cents left from your 4 friends and add it to the 20 cents that they still have of your dollar, and now you have your dollar that you can take out, okay? That's how it works, very roughly speaking. So what I'm trying to say here is that the bank doesn't have all of the money it has on paper, physically, because it's lending it out, right? And so the problem is then, if everyone tries to get their money back, well, the bank doesn't have everyone's money. So this starts a domino effect where they'll close, and before they close, sometimes they'll try to call back the loans from the people they lent money to before they had to pay them. And, well, then the person who got the loan can't pay it back, so they'll go bankrupt too. Maybe their business will close, and so no, they're down. But, I mean, they had to buy equipment for their Pizza Hut or whatever. So that money that they got from the loan from the one bank is, in effect, eventually going to end up in another bank. But all the people are trying to get their money back from all the banks. So all these banks are closing down. And in effect, well, there's a huge demand for money, but there isn't any money anywhere. And so the point here is what Friedman is pointing out, that the Federal Reserve System was created to deal with this situation like this. And so this was the big moment that the Federal Reserve was supposed to do what it was supposed to do. And so when the initial bank failures happened in 1930, they could have put an end to it, but they literally didn't do anything. And so it got worse, and more banks started closing, and there was a more and more of a demand for money. And so it started rolling into a greater and greater crisis that was not inevitable. Okay, so wrapping it up here. So the Federal Reserve messed up big time, and their inaction and, I guess, choice not to do what they were supposed to do, that could have prevented the worst of the Great Depression potentially, or at least eased it by a hell of a lot. Okay, so they didn't do their job, and even if it was an accident, Friedman's saying that it kind of proves that you shouldn't give too much power to a central authority in managing the economy. So we've dealt with two ends here. The gold standard, well, a pure gold standard, a pure automatic gold standard, doesn't exist, never has, and a central managing of the domestic monetary supply. That doesn't work either. So what is Friedman proposing instead? So how is Friedman suggesting that we manage monetary policy then? Well, he advocates for a rules-based approach, a system of laws, essentially, where there's no individual who's specifically deciding what policies to make in economics. We have a system of rules. So if this happens, then this. We don't come up with things on the fly. We don't determine the policies on a day-to-day basis. We just follow essentially like a sheet of rules. So his vision is that the reserve system, their one job would be to see to it, by however means they so desire, that the stock of money in the country rises on a month-by-month basis and rises annually by a certain percent. He says somewhere between 3 and 5%. He doesn't want the Federal Reserve to be doing anything else. No more regulating stuff, managing unemployment. All that stuff goes out the window. Their one job is to make sure that the money stock rises. And then he ends this particular chapter saying that he doesn't see this as a be-all, end-all. It's just a first suggestion of where to start. All right, let's move on. So chapter 4 is titled International Financial and Trade Arrangements. So the issue here is the parity and translation of US dollars into foreign currencies. A lot of this chapter is focused around the gold standard, or as Friedman called it, the pseudo-gold standard that was still in effect when he wrote this book, but is no longer a thing in today's world. So some of it's probably less directly relevant, but whatever. Anyways, so Friedman relates how for a time the U.S. Set a price level of how much they would pay for gold, $35 an ounce, and this was set in 1934, which was at the time above the market price of gold. So, because the U.S. was willing to pay a higher price than what gold was actually worth on the worldwide market, lots of people were willing to sell their gold to us. So we accumulated huge stocks of gold. However, by the time he's writing this, some 30 years later, we haven't changed the fixed price that we're willing to pay for gold. However, the price of gold had risen worldwide. And so in his time, there was a shortage of gold. And so the thought at the time was that we couldn't raise the price of gold because the greatest beneficiaries would be the Soviets and South African government. All these are antithetical to free market principles. Friedman is very upset that when he was writing this, the government made it illegal to hold gold privately. He terms this a nationalization of gold, this government controlling the price of it and keeping it out of people's hands. And so anyways, Friedman says that in discussing monetary relations on the international scale, there's two different problems that you have to deal with. The first is the balance of payments, and the second is the danger of a run on gold. The second reason why that's a problem was pretty much discussed in the previous chapter. Basically, a liquidity crisis. If there's a huge demand for your commodity, but there's no supply. So that's why the gold shortage in his time of writing this was a problem. As to the first issue, the balance of payments, well, he says that the people and government of the U.S. buy foreign currencies with American dollars in order to purchase goods and services, he says, in those countries, among other things, such as investing in their enterprises or paying interest on debts and all the rest of that anyways. So if we're spending our money on foreign currencies, unless if we want to run up a deficit, there has to be an equal amount of dollars being bought by foreign countries to balance it out. Otherwise, we're losing money rapidly. And so he says that the two problems are related in two ways. In the first place, if we have a huge deficit, we're buying foreign currencies, but they're not buying our dollars, or they're at a disparate rate here, it causes a loss of confidence, and the U.S. will have to borrow money in order to balance their books, so to speak, or pay off their dues and loans and all the rest. And the second way that these issues are related is that he was saying that when he was writing this, like I said, none of this is really applicable in today's world, that the price and value of gold was sort of a benchmark for which other things' prices would be based relative at. Because, like we said, the currency used to be kind of backed by, the physical gold. So Friedman paints this simulation here, where the U.S. it's buying foreign currencies and selling dollars at an equal rate and all the rest. Okay, but then all of a sudden, the number of dollars that foreigners want to buy drops, okay? Friedman says that there's only 4 ways to fix this burgeoning crisis. and balance things back out again. So the first way we can reinstitute balance here is that we can let the stock of our gold go down and exchange it for foreign currencies. And the second way follows from what I just said. Okay, so if we have an outflow of gold, as our money was to an extent backed by gold when Friedman was writing this, that means the decline in the value of the money, right? And this would produce a fall in prices and incomes. And this would have the opposite effect for the countries that were buying our gold. It would enhance the value of their money, thereby raising prices and income. And then the lower U.S. prices and the increased foreign prices would make it more attractive to purchase goods from the U.S. than from other places. So that is one way to reduce the deficit. The third manner here is by inducing a change in exchange rates through a change in domestic prices. And you can achieve this through a government just straight up declaring that it's changing its price at which it proposes to pay for a currency, as Friedman says. Or it can even change from day to day. The value of the exchange rate can become a market rate. This is called the freely floating exchange rate, and it would be fully automatic and free for government control. And ultimately, this is what Friedman will advocate for. And the fourth way here is a sort of combination of the second and third mechanism. That is, reduce expenditures of dollars through tariffs, choking off imports, subsidies to stimulate exports, he says. Basically, a whole bunch of government intervention. And from here, Friedman laments that because we don't really have a coherent policy, we pretty much are just doing a whole bunch of schizophrenic things at different points, combining different policies or ways of reducing the deficit kind of without any regard or thought to it. And the problem is that it's often at the expense of the economic freedom of the people. And I guess it strengthens the powers of the federal government. And so he says there's only two mechanisms that are consistent with this free market and free trade idea. One would be the fully automatic international gold standard, which, as we already discussed in the previous section, doesn't exist in reality anywhere. The other way is through the freely floating exchange rates, determined by private transactions without government intervention, he says. And, like I said, this is the kind of thing that we have now, which we didn't when Friedman wrote the book. So, in essence, basically, a currency's value is allowed to fluctuate based on supply and demand for a nation's currency and relative to other nations. And this sort of concluding this chapter, Friedman lists some measures that the U.S. should take in order to promote free markets. These include that the U.S. should eliminate price ceilings and price floors for purchasing and selling gold. They should repeal laws that make it illegal for individuals to hold gold privately, and that the U.S. should also reject any official exchange rates and avoid speculation aimed at influencing exchange rates, he says in his own words. Those are pretty much the big ideas here. And all this would eliminate the balance of payments or the deficit problem. No one would sell dollars unless if there was a demand for those dollars. And so he ends his chapter with a final remonstrance against tariffs, which he says will always hurt us, and we should repeal all of them, basically, even if it's not reciprocated by other countries. All right, let's move on to chapter 5. All right, so chapter 5 is about fiscal policy, or essentially government expenditures. So in the time when Friedman was writing this, the popular thought about government spending was that the government was necessary to sort of act as a balance wheel, as Friedman calls it. That is, when private spending in the economy went down, the thought was that the government should replace the missing private expenditures in the economy, of course, through government spending. That way, the total expenditures in the economy, the money going around, would be stable. However, Friedman says this balance wheel is a fantasy. Every single contraction or recession that happens, the government wastes no time in creating a new spending program or stimulus and upset the balance of the economy. And of course, by the time that these new programs to supposedly counteract the effects of recession take place, the recession will have already been over. To that end, basically, the main problem with the balance wheel theory is that, one, it doesn't actually offset recessions. It upsets the balance in favor of the government. and it enhances the government's activities and powers, and of course, keeps a high tax burden on the people. And to this point, because government expenditures are so large, basically anything they do will have major effects on the economy. And not only that, sort of intellectual dogma at the time sort of implanted into the minds of economists that the only way to achieve this balance, if there's a drop in private spending, there has to be a proportionate rise in government spending. Pretty much the balance wheel theory is not even coherent necessarily, because you see, if it was actually going to be somewhat consistent and logical, it would make sense that we raise taxes during economic booms and then lower them during contractions. But all that aside, even with that in mind, Friedman does not support the balance wheel type of view because, well, it's kind of arbitrary. We don't actually know ahead of time when contractions are going to be, so kind of pretending that we can balance the economy and know how to do it and when to do it is kind of delusional. At the end of the day, every single policy from the government will be reactionary after the fact, and it might even be the wrong choice in the end. What Friedman is advocating instead of all this is that we decide ahead of time what we want our government to do, and then we plan tax rates accordingly. And we would do all this dispassionately, without any regard to the year-to-year economic stability, as he says. And that's pretty much the gist of the chapter. It's a rather short chapter. He spends the rest of it attacking a Keynesian idea of this multiplier theory. Keynesians believe that essentially that for every dollar the government spends, it gets more out of it. That is, if the government spends $1, there might be $3 in GDP growth, a multiplier effect. Friedman argues that it's certainly exaggerated, and he claims that based on his research, that government expenditures to GDP is pretty much even. Because even if the government is spending money on something that alleviates the need for the citizen to pay for it, it doesn't necessarily follow that the citizen will spend their money in a productive way, or even at all. They might save it. So the Keynesian notion that the government will pay for something and then the consumer will spend something and the money will keep going and going and going is not necessarily true, but it's sort of assumed to be. To say it in more simple words here, one of the main tenets of Keynesian economic thought is that government expenditures or spending can stimulate and grow the economy by inducing spending where there otherwise might not have been and investing in things that other people might not have invested in. But, as Friedman says, a rise in government expenditures may very well be offset by a decline in private expenditures. Because, of course, lest you forget, any government expenditure, well, that has to come from either taxes or bonds. So, far from there being a multiplier effect, government expenditures probably lean towards little or no increase in private income. To believe otherwise would be to engage in what he calls economic mythology. Then with that, we've reached the conclusion of this introduction and summary of chapters 3 through 5. Thank you for watching and bearing with me. I hope you have a good one.